We as anglers have a real nasty habit of gravitating to the latest and greatest and disregarding old standbys. But we're going to talk about one of the most consistent old standbys of all time, and that's the tube jig on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us as always by the folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. They are Utah-based with 140 plus stores nationwide, and you can visit them at sportsmans.com. Also, don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. Those guys are mostly outdoorsmen that work there. They understand what you need, and they can hook you up with a pickup truck like my Tundra or an SUV in northern Colorado. So guys, here we are in the middle of February, early February, I guess, and tis the season. Some of you guys are ice fishing, some of you are fishing tailwater, some of you don't live where it freezes, and lucky you. Normally this is the time of year that I travel, but when I'm traveling, I always gravitate to things that are multi-species and very consistent. And the reason that I do that is I don't want to pack everything. So when it comes to packing for just about any species out there, there's not a lot of lures that I take. And you guys know, if you're a fan, you know I grab a couple of jerk baits, I'll grab a couple of gulp minnows on jig heads, I'll grab, you know, some what I consider universal baits like that. But one of them I don't talk as much about, mostly because it's not in the latest and greatest pile, and it's not something that's on anyone's radar these days, and maybe that's part of the charm. But that's the tube jig. And you know, the tube jig was, I think, if I understand this correctly, was invented by the Gets It folks, but I'm not totally sure. And when it first came on the scene, everybody was catching fish with it. I remember back on the day, you know, when one of the earliest contributors to Fishful Thinker Television, Curtis Welch, he had a screen name called Mr. Gets It, because when they first came out, he took that bait and made a lot of people in the state of Colorado pay in bass tournaments by being very good with that bait. Denny Brower, former BASS guy Denny Brower, one of the best there ever was, made a lot of money by taking a tube jig and putting it on a Texas rig and fishing it from there. So it's not really even a tube jig in that case, it's a tube. But he took a tube, put it on a Texas rig, made it a flipping tube, and caught a lot of bass with it. And over the years, I've caught pretty much everybody on the tube. And like I said, it's not chic, it's not glitzy, it's not glamorous, it's not latest and greatest, but it still to this day catches fish. And up until I quit guiding last year, I would go through lots and lots and lots of tube jigs every year, lots of them, to the point where I would re-rig, or I would rig, I should say. I would take jig heads, stuff them in the tubes, have a whole big bag of them ready to go, so every time a client broke off, I could tie another one on, and they breaking them off in the rocks because I guide in really snaggy lakes, and the tube jig's a fantastic way to get smallmouth to bite, and that goes from there. And I remember having a conversation with Al Linder many years ago at ICAST, and I never understood it, because he was talking, he's like, well, you know, I tried this and I tried that. He was referencing smallmouth bass. And well, I couldn't get him going the crankbait, and I tried this and that, and he rattled off a bunch of stuff. And he's like, but they'll always bite a tube jig. And I kind of stopped him right there. I said, well, wait a minute. If you know they'll always bite a tube jig, why are you throwing all the other stuff? And he said, well, because sometimes they'll bite other things better. But at the end of the day, some of them will always bite a tube jig. And I feel that way about a few different baits out there. Same, I feel that way with the gulp minnow as well, but there's many, many days where I have a tube jig on one finesse rod and a gulp minnow on another finesse rod, and we'll go back and forth just to give the fish different looks. At the end of the day, I don't fish them fundamentally different than anybody else as far as tube jigs go or tubes go, but there's lots of ways to rig them, and I do believe that they deserve a spot in your fishing, regardless of the species that you might fish for. So, you know, obviously the standard one is to stuff a jig head in it and go from there. But even at that, there's some nuances to that. So we'll start at the basic and then work out to some more, let's say, advanced rigging options for a tube and go from there. But the jig head stuffed inside the tube, or the classic tube jig, is a very standard deal. But the way the nuances work out depend a little bit on how heavy the head is that you put in that tube. For a given size tube, you can fundamentally change its action. And then even more importantly than that, it can depend on how you stuff that tube or that jig head in that tube. In other words, did I put the tube or the jig head part all the way inside the tube, or did I only put it part of the way inside the tube? And what that's going to come down to, what you're going to see is if you stuff the jig head all the way in to where it's as far inside the tube as it will go, you're going to get a tube that will spiral on a very tight spiral on its way to the bottom. It will sink faster and it will have a very tight spiral. But if I take that same jig head and I back it out of the tube 1/4 of an inch and then poke the eye through and tie to it, now my spiral rate is going to go substantial. So in other words, maybe an 18-inch spiral in the first place or a 12-inch spiral in the first place on slack line as the bait sinks. Now I'll get twice that or more. And so if I want my tube to really glide around, all I have to do is back the tube, or the jig I should say, out of it ever so slightly so that there's airspace at the very front, and that will make the line tie closer to the center of the overall rig, and it will still be slightly heavier on one end or the other, and that will make it glide like crazy. So first thing, if I want it to glide a whole bunch, I don't stuff the jig all the way in it. If I wanted to glide less and sink faster, attain depth faster, then I will stuff the same size jig head all the way forward in the tube. So the first thing depends on where in that tube I put that jig head. Another possibility is either an extremely oversized or an extremely undersized tube, and those can be, jig head within a given tube. So for instance, I might take a power tube, a 3.5 inch power tube, and I might stuff a 1/2 ounce jig head in it even at times, and then at other times I might stuff a 1/16 ounce jig head in it. And the difference in those two baits and how they react is gigantic. The heavy jig head was going to make that thing want to plummet. It's not going to glide, it's going to plummet. You're going to be able to feel it, you're going to be able to snap jig it really aggressively and keep control of it, and you're going to be able to throw it in the wind. The flip side is it will snag a whole bunch more. Now, you can offset that by being very good at controlling slack line. We've done whole podcasts about that. Go look those up, that's a separate deal. But the heavier the head, the more it's going to want to snag. If I have a very light jig head in it, my fall rate drops a whole bunch for starters, which is pretty intuitive. Also, my glide rate changes. So I will glide more if I have a lighter jig head in it. And the bait's just generally less reactive overall. So if I want a more subtle, more gliding type presentation, I can put a very light weight in the jig or in the tube and get it to go from there. So that can be a key part as well. It's just by major oversizing or undersizing. And a good example of that, I was in the boat with Steve Kennedy. I was his marshal. Steve Kennedy's a BASS pro, very, very fishy guy, by the way. If you haven't ever followed him, interesting guy, Steve Kennedy is. But we were on Bull Shoals, and he was fishing a relatively deep, like a 20-foot deep rock ridge. And he stuffed like a 3/4 ounce jig head in a 4-inch tube jig. And that was a big old jig, like it would barely fit in that tube jig. And then he started snapping that thing really aggressively on casting tackle. Well, not only did he pick off several of the nice bass that he was looking for, and I want to point out, he is not a giant electronics guy, or at least he wasn't at this time. He was more just fishing structure, not specific fish or anything like that. This was not a forward-facing sonar thing or even seeing fish under the boat. He just was looking where the structure was and throwing this tube out on a long cast and snapping it like crazy with the heavy jig head in it, like 2 or 3 feet up off the bottom and then letting it go back down. Well, he caught several quality bass doing that, but he also caught some really quality walleyes doing that. And that kind of opened my eyes a little bit about, wait a minute, the walleyes will bite that same presentation on the fast fall rate. And so I have adapted that and made it work at other places, including my home lake here at Horsetooth Reservoir, as well as Glendale up in Wyoming, which gets tons and tons of pressure. But I bet those walleyes don't see a lot of tube jigs, and they certainly don't see a lot of really big tubes that are snapped really aggressively. So that's, again, another variable that works really good is with the jig head in the tube. And I want to point out, it could be as little as a 64th ounce jig head in a 3/4 inch tube, all the way up to maybe a 1 ounce or even more jig head in a 6 or 7 inch long tube that I might use for lake trout or even pike. And definitely people don't think about heavy tubes for pike, or at least not very many people. But that big tube jig that you just scooch along the bottom with a big heavy jig head in it, and you just scooch it along, you'll see pike roll up on their side and pick that thing up really good. It can be excellent. So tube jigs really good for pike. In that case, I typically upsize them quite a bit, and it's all about either keeping it to the bottom or giving it a really gliding fall. And either of those are good ways to get pike. So there's a good thing there. And the other thing, crappies, a tube jig will hang horizontally just based on its fundamental design, particularly if the jig head is not stuffed all the way in it. So if you start talking about vertical fishing for crappie right under your boat, or dangling right over a dock, or dabbing down standing trees, as they call that, dabbing, a tube jig is an excellent call for that, because it will hang horizontally, and then you can literally do subtle little drops up and down with it and go from there. And Berkley spent a lot of money to figure out that the more appendages and things they put on a bait, the less bites it gets, which is part of the reason that Ned rigs were so popular. But before Ned rigs, tube jigs were probably the most innocuous bait you could get. And that's probably explains why they were particularly so good in the early days. In those days, everybody wanted to have appendages and tails and curl tails and all that. And suddenly a jig that has, or a tube, a plastic shape that has very little movement to it, natural movement anyway, was a great fish catcher. And so that's kind of where the whole thing was rooted in, and the tube jig is a classic example of that. And so something where less is more, like the crappies, really excellent call. Another one that seems like some guys are really gravitating to now, but wasn't so popular 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is trout fishing. And trout love tubes, and they love the classic tube jig with the jig head stuffed in it, and you can retrieve it horizontally, and it will kind of hunt around where it won't come straight to you, again, because the line tie is not in the front of the bait, it's on the top. And so the bait will kind of hunt if you just do an even very, very slow retrieve. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, if you try to retrieve it fast, you're going to get a ton of spin and twist, and it's going to cause you some problems. But if you just throw the tube, let it sink to whatever depth you want, and then very slowly wind it straight back to you, you'll be amazed at how much it will hunt around. And it'll cover a couple, 3 feet of water side to side just from its own design as it's trying to sink, and you just retrieve it along. So that can be really good. Also, as you're doing that, you can at any point just kill the retrieve and let it sink on tight line, and it will pendulum to you, and it will do the same thing on its way to the bottom. Or you can kill the retrieve altogether and then guard it with the rod and follow it down, let it go straight down, and it will spiral straight down. And if I had a nickel for every trout that I'd caught doing that specifically, I could just quit and go fishing for the rest of my life, because there, particularly years ago, before we had some of the newer baits that we have that are really designed to refine that tube jig, with the power switch being a classic example of that. I used to take a tube jig and wind it very slowly, and I'd get to a certain point in a weed line or something, just stop the retrieve altogether and drop the rod tip and just start following the bait down. And you talk about a good way to get a lot of bites. Really good way to get a lot of bites. And that was something I did for trout for a long time, and I still do it. I just do it with things like the power switch now more often, because it's just got a little bit even more versatility to it. But the tube jig, make no mistake, if I have a small selection of tubes and a small selection of jig heads, I can mix and match and cover a lot of bases in a hurry with that. So let's talk about some other key things about a tube that you can do besides the jig, because I think everybody knows that one, and I feel like I'm beating a dead horse a little bit with all the comments about the tube jig specifically. But let's talk about some other nuances that you might not think about. One that can be really good for a tube, if you want a ton of scent, is to take a tiny cotton ball and put it inside the tube jig soaked with, or inside the tube I should say, soaked with whatever scent you like. Could be gulp juice, could be whatever scent you like. Back in the old days, I used a product called Smelly Jelly. There's a slew of scents and flavor things out there. Put that on a cotton ball, small piece of a cotton ball, stuff it inside the tube, and then stuff your jig head in there or rig your tube however you want. And now you'll get scent bleeding out the back of that tube as you fish it. And that will disperse more and faster than just a scented tube, for instance, a power tube or something like that. A power tube will definitely leach a bunch of flavor into the water, but not so fast as if you put a cotton ball in it with juice of some sort on it. So that can be a really good rigging trick, is to put the scent inside the tube. And I've been known to do that for a long time. Another really good trick, and I talked about it a little bit in the beginning, is a Texas rig tube. And you say, oh, well, yeah, okay, we know that. Bass Guy's been doing that forever. You take a 3 to 5 inch long tube jig, or tube, I should say. I got to drop that jig connotation. I'm so stuck on that. But you take a 3 to 5 inch tube, use an offset shank hook, and rig it Texas style with a sliding weight in front of it, and it becomes an excellent bait to catch a lot of fish. Well, I do the same thing besides just bass, by doing it with very small baits, the same kind of thing. So I'll take a 2-inch tube or a 2.5-inch tube and rig it with a small hook, with an offset shank EWG worm hook, and typically I'll use a small, like a number 2 even, or a number 1, or maybe a 1/0, depending on how big the tube is, and the sliding sinker ahead of it. And then I will use that for trout around weeds. Trout in all the shallow lakes that we deal with in the West. There's tons of them in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah that have a ton of weed growth in them. The trout spend most of their time around that weed growth because that's where a lot of the bug life is, and therefore you can get away with fishing in and around it by having a Texas rig. And you almost never see a Texas rig in trout fishing. But it gives you access to trout that are hard to otherwise fish around because of the weed growth. So I will use a Texas rig in that scenario and just do it with a small tube, or even a reasonable sized tube, and a hook that's appropriately sized for it. You don't want the hook to be any longer than the tube jig itself. It needs to be better part of an 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch shorter than the tube, so that you've got some room to actually Texas rig it, and you can then make it weedless. And if you're not familiar with a Texas rig, go to our YouTube channel at Fishful Thinker. There's tons of them on there, and I'll show you how to do it there a bunch. But that will make it effectively weedless. And even more so, you can still put that cotton ball or whatever in there with the scent on it if you are so inclined, if you're going to rig it Texas style. Now, I'll Texas rig a tube, a small tube for smallmouth as well. Again, something you don't see a lot of, but the Texas rig has a completely different fall than does the tube jig. So you have the same profile of the same tube, but if you rig it on a Texas rig instead of on a jig head, it's going to act completely different. So if they like your profile, not your action, well, you can mix it up. Or conversely, you can have both available to you. And there's been quite a few times where I'll have a tube jig rigged, an 1/8 ounce is typical for me, is a 2.5-inch Maxent tube with an 1/8 ounce Fusion 19 jig head in it. That's a very standard tube jig for me to fish for smallmouth bass. But I might take that same tube, put it on an EWG hook with a sliding sinker on it with an 1/8 ounce bullet weight ahead of it, and peg that bullet weight. And then I have basically 2 ways to fish the exact same tube on the same day. And so if I'm around the more open water, for instance, on my home lake here, if I'm around the more open water, I'll throw the open jig head and use the classic tube jig. But then when I get around the willow bushes or some of the soft cover that's in here, particularly when the water's rising, you'll get the terrestrial vegetation that's flooding. I can run the Texas rig tube through there. And we all know that smallmouth love tube jigs, or tubes in general. Well, this gives me a 2-handed approach to doing that. It's the same tube rigged 2 different ways, and makes a giant difference in how that tube acts and where I can throw it. So that's a big one right there that helps people a lot. Another one that I think is way underrated for tube jigs, and I mean way underrated, and why more guys don't do it is beyond me, is either a Mojo rig or a split shot rig or a Little Carolina rig, whatever you want to call it, but where the weight is ahead of the tube, maybe anywhere between, you know, a foot to even 2 or 3 feet ahead of the tube, and then I'll use some sort of a light wire hook in the tube, and typically at that point I'll Texas rig that hook as well to keep the tube on there. That works really good for just dragging the sinker and letting the tube wander around and do what it does, and it works exceptionally well as you just drag it along on the bottom. And if you want it to come up off the bottom, that's not a problem. You can use either a floating jig head in it, or you can put a small piece of foam inside the tube and it will float up. And so then when you drag that Mojo rig or split shot rig or whatever it is, when you drag it, it will literally pull it down towards the bottom, and then when you pause it, it will go up and float back up. So that can be a really tricky way to catch all kinds of fish, and it's a scenario that you very rarely see tube jigs in. It allows that tube to be very natural and swing around a bunch and have, you know, particularly if you have any wave action or anything like that, it's definitely going to have a bunch of subtle action. So that's another way to rig it that you don't see a lot of guys do. And another one is a drop shot. And drop shotting a tube sounds kind of goofy, but I've seen it work really well a few different times. And again, if you want to put something with scent in there, you can, or extra scent over and above the normal amount of scent that might be in a jig. Or in a tube, I should say. So there again, on a drop shot, it works really good. You can nose hook it and go from there. You could work it the same way you would any other drop shot. Or, and I've done this quite a bit, is put the tube on the bottom of the drop shot. So basically the tube jig, it's a true jig head with the tube on it. Rig that on the bottom of your presentation and have your drop shot hook above it on the line, however far, 6 inches, 12 inches, whatever you feel like you need, and with a minnow style bait above it. So something like a gulp minnow or a flat nose, you know, Maxent flat nose minnow or whatever. There's a bajillion minnow baits out there, power minnow, all kinds of minnow baits out there these days. If you have the minnow bait above and the tube jig on the bottom, you've got a little bit of a crayfish, baitfish thing going on. And so you keep the tube stuck to the bottom. And in my case, when I'm doing that, I'll typically stroll the tube, meaning that as the boat drifts, I'm just letting it drag on the bottom as best I can. If it starts to hang, I'll slack it out, give it some shakes, see if it'll pick it up, and then go from there, but just try to drag the bottom. And when you're doing that, you're kicking up the dirt and the dust and whatever off the bottom of the lake, the sediment, and you've got the little minnow feeding along above it. And then you also have the added advantage of you might catch 2 fish at the same time, because once one bites whichever one they bite, the other one's swinging around in the water column. And in case of something like smallmouth bass, you've got a really good 1-2 punch going on. So let's talk quickly about some other species that a lot of people don't think about with tubes, but that I think are underrated. And one of those is white bass. Schooling white bass can be absolute money on a tube jig. A 2 to 3 inch tube jig with a relatively reactive jig head in it, meaning a little bit heavy or rigged a little bit back. Typically, I will throw them in shad colors, a silver or a white or a pearl, something like that. And maybe even a chartreuse, and throw those around white bass. White bass will maul a tube jig, and you don't see a lot of them people purposely doing that, but they will maul it. Same thing with wipers, which is no surprise given that they're related. But that's a species I think is underrated for the tube. Another one that's really underrated for the tube, in my opinion, is saltwater. If you're listening to this and you go red fishing or snook fishing or species like that, again, tube is a fantastic tool for them. And on the flats for bonefish, a small tube is surprisingly effective on flats fishing as well. So for target casting to fish you can see. So another example you might not think about with a tube, you see almost nobody doing it in salt water, and why, I don't know, because it's been very effective wherever we go. Other scenarios besides the bass family, everybody thinks of tubes in the bass family. Obviously panfish, little tiny tubes, panfish, fantastic. I already mentioned crappies, But bluegills, shell crackers, pumpkin seeds, all of those, same thing. A little 1-inch tube jig can be really good for those species. And it's something that a lot of guys don't think about, but it's good. I already mentioned pike, and on the pike, I go on the upper end of the spectrum for tubes. I like big tubes for pike, but works great. And then, of course, lake trout. I had my most epic day ever of lake trout fishing with a big 6-inch long tube jig and a 1-ounce jig head in it, and fishing shallow lakers. They were only 25 to 40 feet deep, but you want that tube jig to hit the bottom and stay there. So it's got a big heavy jig head in it, and I'm just barely picking it up and down, and it's a great way to catch lake trout. And it's, again, underrated in that scenario. Although these days I think a lot of guys throw them there. So kokanee salmon, little tiny tubes for kokanee salmon in reds and oranges, colors like that can work really good, and that's a unique one. And then we talked about walleyes, and I'll Texas rig them and pitch them into the trees at places like Glendo when the walleyes are all piled in the willow bushes and cottonwoods. I'll snap jig it, like I mentioned with Steve Kennedy, with a heavy weight in it around fish in more open water. There's just a bunch of scenarios where you can fish it there as well. So bottom line is this: a tube jig is a tube. I've got to get that jig head out of my system. Don't pigeonhole it with just tubes, people. If you hear me doing that, that's because I'm being hard-headed about it as well. But there are lots of ways to rig it and lots of species to address with it, and it definitely deserves a spot in your tackle box. So I carry them day in and day out all the time, 2.5 and 3.5-inch tubes. Those are typically going to be Maxent, Pyrobait Maxent tubes in those sizes. I will carry the old school power tubes in a couple different sizes. I'll carry little tiny tubes. I'll carry some great big tubes. I'll carry a range of tubes depending on the species of fish I'm at. And then last thing I'll throw out there, I love tubes in a translucent color if you can find them. There's been a bunch of power tubes in translucent colors. It gives the illusion of if you ever look at a minnow, you can kind of see their guts. They're semi-translucent. You can see their guts in there. Well, same thing with the tube jig. With the jig head becomes effectively the guts inside there. So can be excellent to have a translucent tube in very clear water. Works really good. So tubes, I think they're underrated, particularly these days. I think more guys should throw them in more scenarios, and I think you'd be surprised at how effective they'll be. So if you want to join the conversation with us, we'd appreciate that. Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Hopefully you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, but wherever you're listening, hopefully you will share and like and subscribe while you're there. Of course, YouTube channels at Fishful Thinker as well, and new shows airing weekly on Altitude Sports and World Fishing Network. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.